Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. In today's program, we're going to look at the Islamic civilizations, the origins of the Islamic civilization and Islam in particular. And it's almost impossible to understand the Islamic civilization without looking at the key personality, the Holy Prophet of Islam. In relation to the Holy Prophet of Islam, listeners will have seen that there is immense damage being done to the personality of the Holy Prophet of Islam, what he stood for, what he presented to the Muslims and the world in particular, which is a tragedy. Yet only a few decades back, there was a book written by Michael Hart called Ranking of the Top 100, Ranking of the Most Influential Persons in History. And he put the Holy Prophet of Islam as the number one personality and showing the importance of it. And it's really unfortunate the state of affairs we see in relation to the Prophet of Islam and the Islamic civilization. And I'm going to turn to my two guests, Amjad Hussain from Leeds, to give me some answers to these. Amjad, welcome.
Oh, thank you very much, and thanks for having me on.
Pleasure. And Arif Ahmad, welcome again, Arif.
Thank you, Dr.
So, Amjad, with that introduction, why do you think there is this animosity towards the Holy Prophet of Islam, the caricatures that the Western world tends to bring up regularly, and then obviously a lot of the things that are going on in the Middle East?
Well, of course, it's multifold. The answers are, of course, Dr. Iqbal, but obviously there is the 1400 years of interaction that Islam had with the Western civilization and with most civilizations. But one needs to understand that Islam had very humble origins in the Arabian Peninsula, and one must go back to trace his roots in that region and the personalities involved before we can answer that question fully, really.
So, clearly, he was the chief of the prophets, one of the most important prophets in a line of prophets. Arif, can you give us some sort of idea of what pre-Islamic society was like before we go into the arrival of the Holy Prophet of Islam?
Yes, I mean, this may surprise particularly non-Muslims that at the time, Arabia, where the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, was born, was a completely decadent, lawless society. And the injustices and the treatment of individuals was very, very poor. Just to give you some examples, I don't want to dwell upon this point, but just to sort of set the scene, alcohol, drinking, fighting with each other, usurping each other's property, the status of women was very, very poor. They were treated almost as slaves or chattels. And it was in this backdrop that the Holy Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, was born. And it was, as I said, a completely lawless society. And I suppose in a way this showed that if people like that could be reformed and they would listen to the message of the Holy Prophet, then there was hope for the rest of the world. Muslims believe that the Holy Prophet was not just brought for the people of Arabia at that time, but his message was valid for everybody. So the people there had no concept. They believed in multifaceted gods. I think they had one God for every day of the week. So there was, even though they came from the Christian Judaic tradition, who do believe in one God, over time they had drifted away from this belief, and they believed in many, many gods. And it was much more about power and influence. If you had a strong tribe and you had money, then you obviously dominated.
Amjad, in relation to the people of Mecca, the Holy Prophet came from a prominent clan, tribe, the Quraysh, and their origins can be traced back in many ways to Abraham and his progenies. Can you shed
absolutely.
some light?
As Arif previously alluded to, the Arabian Peninsula is mainly desert, desert and arid, very hostile conditions, hardly any agriculture apart from some oasis towns and some springs, and people lived mainly nomadic lifestyle, and they moved with the pastures and so on. And there were only two major cities, Mecca and Medina. They were the two predominant cities, Mecca being the shrine of the Kaaba, where Arif previously alluded to, house over 360 idols for each day of the month. And the three chief deities were Alad, Uzza and Manat, also wrongly associated as the three daughters of Allah, God be forbid, forbid. But that's what the state of the people was, and the chief tribe at that time and predominant tribe in Mecca was the Quraysh, and Prophet Muhammad was born into the clan of Hashim. And basically the tribal society was predominantly tribal, and each tribe had longer heads and over feuds of centuries. But of course they were pagans, as well as they had their origins in the Abrahamic faith, and the Prophet came from the 12 sons of Ishmael, and Ishmael and Abraham were the progenitors of the Prophet and most of the Arabs in that part of the region.
As Arif alluded to, there were obviously Jews, Christians practicing their faith around that time as well. But these tribes of Mecca and around Medina were largely pagans with a variety of idols. How did it get to that stage? Because clearly if Ishmael was related to Abraham, who was a strong believer, as we've covered in previous programs, a strong believer in the one God, how do you explain that?
Well, obviously, 3,000 years at last, that's one thing. And over time, these tribes obviously lost track of the original monotheistic message of Prophet Abraham and Prophet Ishmael and their offspring. And of course, this is alluded to in the Torah as a promise to Hagar.
Deuteronomy, there's a prophecy, Arif, isn't there, in Deuteronomy?
Yes, actually, it's in the Genesis. It's in Genesis when Hagar is outcast due to the jealousy of Sarah, and this is exactly what it says in Genesis, that the angel of the Lord appears, and Hagar calls the angel of the Lord Elroy, and the angel says, "Why do you cry? Look at the stars. I will multiply you thy exceedingly, and I'll make you a great nation." So this was a promise to Hagar. So when people speak of the covenant to Abraham, of course, and what makes a great nation? Because if you look at the Israelites, they always had mercy, and of course the mercy of the Lord be with you as well. What is the mercy of the Lord? The mercy of the Lord is continuously being righteously guided through the message of the prophet. The Israelites had prophets, from Isaac and Jacob all the way to John the Baptist and Prophet Jesus, of course. Well, the Jews don't accept Prophet Jesus, but we Muslims believe that, Prophet Jesus was sent as a Messiah to the lost sheep of Israel. But of course, if the Ishmaelites are also blessed, and the blessing of the Lord is with Hagar, as promised and alluded to in Genesis, then of course that prophecy is to be fulfilled, and is to be fulfilled in the person of the Prophet ﷺ, because he descends directly from Ishmael and from one of his, of course, Jacob has 12 sons called Israel, so there are 12 tribes of Israel. There were 12 tribes of Ishmael.
And in a sense, obviously Isaac had many people from his progeny and succeeded. But here in Deuteronomy, I think there is a specific verse talking about thy brethren, that I will raise a prophet. Arif?
Yes, if I just read the exact reference. So in Deuteronomy verse 18, it reads, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything I command him." So,
and this is what Amjad is relating to as well, from obviously Ismail's progeny.
Absolutely. So in essence, that this is a prophet that would come in the same spirit, would have a direct connection with Allah, with God, and would basically be speaking the revealed words of God. Now, Christians might believe that this relates to Prophet Jesus, but as Muslims, we obviously believe that this relates to Prophet Muhammad, and this fulfills a prophecy that was in Deuteronomy.
So we're going to come back to that later. So let's go back to then the early childhood of the Prophet of Islam. You had this society of idol worshippers, and as Arif explained, with all their social ills and problems. Who's going to go first? Because the Prophet of Islam had quite a difficult childhood. If you look at it from a normal young person's point of view. Do you want to go first, Amjad?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the Prophet, peace be upon him, was born, as we said, in Mecca in 570 of the Common Era, and he lived to an age of 61, 62, depending which date you look at. And at a very early age, he was orphaned. I think when he was a baby, he lost his. I think he was. I think his father before his father passed away, and then when he was a baby, I think he lost his mother.
6 years.
6 years. Sorry, 6 years when he was probably an infant. And at the age of 13, of that time, of course, he was in the care of his grandfather, Abu Muttalib. And at a very young age, he became a merchant. He accompanied his I think grandfather or one of the uncles.
The grandfather passed away after a few years of his mother going away. So his uncle,
probably took him as
Abu Talib looked after him.
Took him as,
and then obviously he grew up around that period.
Around that time. So at a very early age, he became a merchant and accompanied his uncle in the caravan trade to Syria. And thereupon he came upon the Christian monk who recognized the signs of an elevated and spiritually guided, a young man or as a child, and he feared greatly for him and for his safety and security. So he conveyed to Abu Talib that to take good care of Mohammed and to protect him, because he could feel he could see that he will have some troubles later on.
I want to just come back to the early childhood bit, though, Arif. He developed quite a strong personality amongst the Meccans and his clan living around. And I'm going to come to the trades bit where he gained a lot of experience and interaction with different people.
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the best ways of sort of summarising this is that he had developed very good morals from a very young age, despite all the hardships. Maybe these hardships were the thing that instilled this good morals in him, and throughout.
I mean, most people in this day and age would think you lose your father, you lose your mother, you lose your grandfather very early on, your guardians,
absolutely,
and you're going to just fall apart. But Allah has His way with His chosen people.
Allah protected him, and despite that, he was very humble, very modest, and respected by all of his family and all of his tribe. And as he developed into a young man, two of the qualities that he became known for were being truthful and being trustworthy. And he had these attributes or names of Al-Sadiq and Al-Amin, meaning the most truthful and the most trustworthy. And that showed that people recognized the good qualities within him. He stayed away from all of the vices that were around him, all of the temptation that was there. As you mentioned, when your parents die, it's very easy to get dragged down into that. But he completely abstained from that, completely stayed away, wasn't interested in that thing. Even simple things like if there was a family meal, he would be the one that would invariably have the meal at the last. He would let everybody else, however many people were there, take their food first, and he would be the one that would take the food last. So this was the good morals, the good training, the good character, and the good qualities that he was developing from a very young age. And this obviously stood him in good stead for what was to come and for his life as a prophet.
Clearly, he was not a recluse, because he became a young trader. He used to go with the caravans. Amjad, that must have developed his personality and independent thinking.
Oh, absolutely. At a very young age, I think some historians say that at the age of 13, he accompanied his uncle on various caravan trades as far away as Syria, Damascus, and so forth. So he acquired, the trust that the Meccans placed in him. That was further enhanced by his amicable trading. When he traded, he was amicable in his dealing as a merchant. He used to take minimum profits, and he was honest and trustworthy. And I think very early on, he stamped his authority as being the Al-Sadiq and Al-Amin, and that continued through all his life. So as the principle is, if one can be trusted in small matters, one can be trusted in higher matters.
I mean, this is where this particular quality paid dividends in many ways. He was working for Khadija, one of the wealthiest ladies of Mecca. And Arif, do you want to take us through that period? What drew her attention to it?
Well, I think what drew her attention was that although he wasn't working directly for her, he was obviously in her employment, and his manager or the people that were looking after him reported back to her that this was a very trustworthy person, a very truthful person, but at the same time a very hardworking and honest sort of person who was looking after the monies entrusted to him, looking after the caravans, etc., and also obviously generating a profit for her business. But I mean, I think it wasn't so much the commerce side, it was his personal characteristics that made her curious as to who this person was, because she obviously was hearing good reports. Anybody who met him, he would leave a positive impression upon them. Even if he met them just for a short time, people knew that there was something special, truthful and honest about this person. And as with any employee, you would want to find out who is this person and what are they and what are they doing. And she was so impressed, as you mentioned, by him, that although she was a widow, she was 40 years old, and the Holy Prophet at that time was 25 years old. She offered to marry him, and he accepted. And also at the same time, she in effect trusted her property to him. Now, there's a very good example here, even though he was only 25, and at that time, obviously, you don't have your full maturity yet. If somebody gives you a lot of money, a lot of people might say, well, this is great, let's spend it on whatever. But he used that money mainly for the alleviation of poverty and giving the money to the poor. And also the slaves that she might have had, he more or less freed them overnight. So it shows the character of the Holy Prophet, that despite becoming wealthy, you could say, very quickly by getting married, he knew that wealth was on trust, and that really he should use it in a positive way to help others, and only retain what he needed just to meet his basic needs.
I mean, he also had a very special quality, Amjad, didn't he? And as an individual, very reflective and thinking about God. And take us through that bit of his development in the sort of early stages before we talk about prophethood.
Well, he used to contemplate a lot and reflect on the life and life generally in the Arabian Peninsula, and the hardship of the people, and also the greater questions of who we are, what we come from, what's the purpose of life itself, and so forth. And he used to, of course, the downtime he had from his business affairs, he used to spend that in retreats in the nearby mountains cave of Hira, and he used to contemplate and reflect in the remembrance of the Lord, and he will meditate in the cave of Hira for quite extended times on occasions, and it was on such an occasion that the angel Gabriel called upon him, and of course the prophet wasn't expecting that.
This is a fascinating story, isn't it? Because and it's very important in relation to his development, because he was an unlettered, he didn't go to normal schooling, didn't get the normal teaching, etc. He was relatively an illiterate person, but yet highly spiritually developed. And as he said, this experience is an interesting one, because he was lying in the cave when this voice suddenly said to him, read or recite.
Yes.
Iqra is the first revelation, first word. And he said, well, I can't read or I can't recite. And again, this force felt as though embraced him and squeezed him and says, read or recite. And after which the very first revelation, and I'll read that because it's a very important revelation for Muslims, for the world, and how it became incorporated in the Holy Quran. It says, recite in the name of thy Lord who created man from, normally we translate it as a blood clot, but I would call it a clinging form, something that clings.
Form, yes.
So who created man from a clinging form. Recite, thy Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man what he knew not. And this absolutely shocked the Prophet of Islam. And do you want to, the accounts we have of
yes, absolutely,
what happened to him after he received this.
Of course, although he was a spiritual person, to receive a direct message from God via the angel Gabriel, this would shock any person to the core. And Prophet Muhammad, as a man, had human emotions, human feelings.
Yet he didn't know who. We talk about Gabriel.
We talk about
because
this is something that just happened to him. He wasn't expecting or warned about this in advance. So it did affect him deeply, and it did shock him. And of course, He went home. But what we do know from historical accounts is that he was basically shivering and trembling at the experience. And when he got home, he asked his wife, Hazrat Khadija, to put something to cover him, just to at least give him some comfort and at least keep him warm, because he just had this experience that he'd never experienced before in his life. And of course, once he had had time to calm down and reflect upon what we said, and he explained this to Hazrat Khadija, she accepted it. She knew the quality and of her husband's character and what he was, and she knew that he was incapable of lying. And if this is something that he said he had experienced, she believed it without question.
And that's where she offered him to go see her cousin Waraka bin Nawfal. Who was a Christian.
Who was a Christian monk. And yes, of course, and the wife offered Hazrat Khadija radiallahu anh, to take Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to the cousin of hers, who was a Christian, of course. And
so clearly he was familiar with the prophets and angels.
Yes, he was absolutely familiar with the Judeo-Christian things, and going through the emotions of things, and the Prophet narrated what had happened to him in the cave and so forth, and he obviously reflected, and he said, well, this appears to be the same angel that descended upon Moses and the Israelite prophets, and so he, in a way, he knew, he kind of calmed the Prophet down. He says, well, it's not something negative, it's something positive and something to rejoice about.
I mean, that was just such an interesting development, really, when you think back. Of somebody who was not familiar at that stage with all the Judeo-Christian teachings that were going around, when he had this experience. And then, of course, he continued on his reflection, and the Holy Quran continued. The first revelation was around 610 AD, I think.
Something around that, yes.
So over a period of 32, 33 years, he continued to receive...
22, 23 years.
22, 23 years. Yeah.
Some historians say 609 of the Common Era till 632, which is basically from the age of 39 to about 62 till he passed away. Yes.
We're going to talk about the impact of Islam and all that. But before I do that, what was the response of the Meccans then? Clearly, throughout his life, he had been called Sadiq, Amin, trustworthy. Everybody loved him. What happened? Go on.
Well, initially, of course, his good childhood friends, when he narrated the story to his childhood friends, particularly Abu Bakr, I think people need to understand this, and I'm a bit emotional here. Of course, his own household, his cousin Ali, who was brought up by Khadija and by the Prophet Muhammad, he lived among the household, so he was the first convert to Islam, along with the Khadija radiallahu anh. And then, of course, his best friends, and namely Abu Bakr, and who's also called Sadiq himself, so he embraced Islam.
So they accepted it straight away. They accepted it straight away
because they knew the Prophet, the character he was, and he had already stamped his authority and was well known as being the most trustworthy, the most honest person, and they knew what he was all about, basically. And I think not just his friends, but also the Meccans generally knew who Muhammad was. He was extremely likable individual. There are actually stories before revelation when he acted as an arbiter when there was a dispute of laying the foundations of the Kaaba and setting the black stone, the Hajar Aswad, and the tribes were squabbling over it, and Muhammad just happened to walk in that day, and he brought peace to the town, because the tribes were squabbling over it, and it could have led to some feuds and some bloodshed, but he stopped the bloodshed, and he's by intervening to mediate it. He said, well, why don't you, all the tribes, put the stone on a cloth, and then why don't you all grab the cloth, and they did likewise. And when obviously came to placing the stone, the Prophet himself grabbed hold of it, and he placed it in the niche in the Kaaba,
and nobody argued.
And he saved the day.
I suppose that the Meccans were in a bit of a quandary. They knew all of the excellent qualities that the Holy Prophet had. They knew that he was trustworthy. They knew that he was truthful. But obviously when he presented a message which completely changed their way,
I mean, the central message he brought was one God. And they had all these idols.
They could not accept that. Yeah. And of course, they had various schemes and plots maybe they thought that he had gone mad or something. Then if that didn't work, then they thought, well, let's try and bribe him. And so, they were presenting it with, you can have as much money as you want, as many wives as you want, whatever wealth you want. We will give this to you. Please stop preaching this message. Yeah. Now, of course, the Holy Prophet was so firm in his faith. He had been given such comfort and such peace of mind by this message from God that he knew there was no turning back. And the famous, incident is that what he said is that even if you put the sun in one hand and the moon in the other, I will not stop preaching this message. And again, of course, the Meccans didn't like this, but they knew that he was steadfast in what he was believing. And of course, this just increased their opposition. They then started all sorts of plots, which we probably will come on to, as to how they could stop this message of Islam spreading, because it was a beautiful message. Anybody that sat down, listened to what the Holy Prophet was saying, listened to the revelations that he'd received, was naturally inclined towards receiving it. But the rest of society that didn't want to change, they obviously had a very different view and wanted this message to be stamped out.
I mean, obviously, earlier on, they felt that they could influence him through his family, through others, and persuade him to stop. But that clearly was failing. And then the sad chapter started, the persecution started. I think let's have a little break before we get on to that side, because that's one of the most difficult phases for the early Muslims, the persecution and what happened and how it happened. So let's have a little break and we'll come back. Welcome back to the program on Origins of Islam. Before the break, we were talking about the response of the Meccans to the Holy Prophet ﷺ's message and Islam and its arrival. After all the persuasion and bribery failed, clearly the Meccans turned to persecution. So, Arif, do you want to take us through what that was like?
I mean, there was many incidents of persecution. All Muslims, including the Holy Prophet, suffered persecution, maybe sometimes verbal, sometimes physical. But I suppose one of the best examples and one of the most noble examples is that of Hazrat Bilal. He was a slave. He was a person who used to call the first call to prayer, the azan. And he went through enormous torture, you can call it, dragged on hot sands, stones placed on his front or on his back, and these were heavy stones in the burning sun. And his only response to all of this persecution was Ahad, meaning that there is only one God. And this was an example for the other Muslims, despite the persecution. And at that time, I think it's important to remember that the Muslims were not fighting back. There is a concept today, which we'll come on to talk about jihad, where you are allowed to defend yourself. But at that time, the Muslims bore this persecution with forbearance, with patience. In a way, maybe it was part of their character forming and showing how steadfast that they were. And in some ways, this also attracted other people, that they could see that despite this persecution, the Muslims would never turn back. And all of these persecutions actually generally increased their faith. But this was countless, and this is something that they had to endure for many years.
There was also a horrible incident, wasn't it, when the Holy Prophet of Islam was praying. And I can't remember which of the chiefs or Meccans it was, but he brought
Abu Jahl.
Yeah, Abu Jahl in through
the sheepskin.
Sheepskin.
The sheepskin and also the stomach of a sheep upon the Prophet, peace be upon him. And not to forget, Dr. Iqbal, there were also very early Muslim martyrs as well. There was a husband and wife who converted to Islam, and because they came from a very minor tribe and they were of a very poor background, and they were torn. I think the lady who converted to Islam, her legs were attached to the two camels, and she was basically deceased through that, and there were a lot of tortures the Muslim endured, and I think it was very prolonged, this period of torture, and Muslims were also excommunicated for a period of time, a good 4 or 5 years, where nobody was allowed to trade with them, nobody was allowed to sell things to them, and they were basically encircled in a valley. They were just basically kicked out of their homes, and they were basically put into what you can say a modern day gulag,
a social boycott.
A social boycott.
Yeah.
But no, they were also a social boycott, but they were taken out of their homes and placed in this valley in the mountains, and they were literally there left to starve and fend for themselves and to forage, and this torture continued for good 13 years. And this is the episode of history where one of the prophet's wife succumbed to all these hardships, and she passed away.
I mean, this intolerance and hatred was quite deep, wasn't it? I mean, Hazrat Umar Raziallahu Anhu's case was also interesting, where he found that his sister had accepted Islam, and he went rushing with a sword to kill her. Arif, do you want to...
Absolutely. I mean, he was, in the beginning, one of the greatest opponents of Islam. And obviously, as a man of action, as a man who wanted to get things done, he had resolved to try and do everything he possibly could to destroy Islam. But when he got this message from one of his contacts that you should look at your own house, i.e., your own sister has accepted Islam, he was enraged, totally enraged. Went straight away to his wife, to his sister's house, with the intention, basically, of destroying them. And when he reached there, his sister and his brother-in-law were there, and he heard the Holy Quran, verses of the Holy Quran, being recited, and he raised his sword to kill his brother-in-law, but his sister stepped in the way, and he accidentally hit her instead. Now, although she wasn't seriously injured, the blood that came out from her, this softened his heart, and there was a transformation, you can say, almost at that point. And he said, "Okay, let me listen to these verses." He washed. His sister said, "No, you don't want to listen to this," but he said, "No, I want to listen to this." So he did his ablutions and he listened to the verses that were being recited, and this changed him. And then he became a Muslim. He accepted the message of the Holy Prophet, and this, in a way, was something that fortified the Muslims. They could see that a person who was previously very opposed to Islam, through a simple incident, through the grace of God, now became a Muslim. So, although there were many horrendous incidents and people being killed, as Amjad Sahib has just mentioned, there were also, in effect, triumphs in the sense that people were accepting Islam despite all this persecution that was going on around them.
Around 3 to 4 years after the mission of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, started, the persecution became particularly bad, and he sent a large group of his followers to Abyssinia. But that's for another time. But within Mecca, the persecution got worse and worse. And then I think the Holy Prophet made a decision that he needs to move. Do you want to take us through that sort of period when he had to migrate to Medina? What triggered that? And it's a very interesting scenario of what happened when they tried to kill him.
There is basically there was a town north of Mecca, about 250 miles away, and that consisted of many Jewish tribes and also some pagan tribes, and they were literally loggerheads with each other. And the elder said, "We cannot continue this state of warfare that is among us. Let's find somebody who's can be arbiter, or somebody a faithful arbiter, an honest person to settle our affairs." And they heard the good name of the Prophet. So can you imagine another rival city-state to Mecca, and the Prophet's reputation went before him.
Yes.
He had such a good reputation despite being persecuted in Mecca,
his hometown.
in his hometown. The town that was further up north, and obviously the Prophet must have done something good.
Medina, Yathrib.
And basically the elders met the Prophet, which is present day now, I think, Jeddah, on the coast of the the Red Sea, and they said, the Prophet preached to them about Islam, and that he was the Prophet of Allah. He says, well, some of them converted, but some others said, look, let's put the Prophet to one side. We have our own affairs, and we need somebody to sort them out. And they said, well, we will see if you are the Prophet of the Lord or not. Why don't you come to our town and settle our affairs? So basically entered into treaty, and of course when the Meccans learned that the Prophet is to flee,
but I think before we get to that migration, the timing and the way it was done is quite interesting as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a very interesting episode in history. Obviously, most of the Muslims in Mecca had left by that point. They had informed the Prophet. The Prophet said to them, yes, for your own safety. He wanted to look after as many Muslims as possible. He didn't want them to go through the atrocities. By that time, effective the Meccans wanted to kill all the Muslims. They thought this is the only way to destroy Islam.
Including Prophet Muhammad.
Including the Prophet. Kill them all.
Yeah.
That way there won't be any Islam. So obviously in that situation, it was quite right that they went to a place of safety. And as Amjad Sahib has just described, Medina was much more sympathetic and they were safe there. Now there even came a time where there was very, very few Muslims left, and the Holy Prophet was given permission by God, or instructed by God, that he too also should go to Medina. Now, of course, this had to be planned because the Meccans also, coincidentally or otherwise, had planned that they were going to kill the Holy Prophet, because they thought, well, he's the leader of the Muslims. If we kill him, there'll be no Islam. Everything will finish. So on that particular night, the Holy Prophet had arranged with his cousin, Hazrat Ali, that he would take his place in the house, sleep in his bed, and under the cover of darkness, he would slip out with Hazrat Abu Bakr, and they would go to Medina. And they were going, in effect, on foot. It was going to take them 3 or 4 days to get there. So the Meccans were watching the house, and they didn't see that the Holy Prophet had left. The next day, when they entered the house and they saw Hazrat Ali was there, they obviously were frustrated. They did beat and hit Hazrat Ali and torture him. He was very steadfast. And then they decided to track the Holy Prophet and Hazrat Abu Bakr. They had professional trackers, just like you might see in some of the cowboy films. They could follow people and they could see where they were going. And they had the better resources, the camels and all of the resources to follow the Holy Prophet and Hazrat Abu Bakr. So they pursued him. They wanted to make sure that he would not get to Medina, because they knew that when he reached there, that's where they suspected he was going, that he would have some relative peace and relative safety, and that Islam would flourish. So the interesting issue here is that as they were pursuing him, obviously the Holy Prophet and Hazrat Abu Bakr had to hide somewhere, had to go somewhere where they would not be caught. And they went into a cave. And it was a cave. When we say cave, it was a very uncomfortable cave. They had to crawl just to get into that cave, and they had to wait there. And the tracker that was tracking them said, well, they have come to this cave. But in the meantime, as is Allah's will, a spider had woven a web on the outside of that cave. And
the pigeon had laid the eggs as well.
Absolutely. So people wonder, well, how could they be hiding in there?
This is Allah's plans.
Absolutely. And inside, Hazrat Abu Bakr and the Holy Prophet, obviously they were concerned, not necessarily trembling or fearful.
They could hear them.
They could see their feet. But the Holy Prophet said to Hazrat Abu Bakr that, do not worry. Although it looks like there is 2 here, there's actually 3. And the other one is Allah. He is with us. So, of course, the Meccans then went away. They felt that it was not possible anybody was hiding in there, and they went off the scent. And through the help of Allah, the Holy Prophet and Hazrat Abu Bakr managed to safely reach Medina. And this, of course, is known as the Hijrah.
Yeah.
And this is, in
the
effect,
Islamic calendar.
The Islamic calendar starts from that point. And this is, in effect, a turning point in Islam, where the Meccans had lost the power that they had over the Muslims, because they were emigrated to Medina.
I mean, this was a period, Amjad, when there was a degree of stability for the Holy Prophet.
This is exactly. I just want to say something that, most of the calendars in the world these days follow either the death of a prophet or the birth of a prophet, as in the case of Judo-Christian, the birth of Jesus, Prophet Jesus, alayhi salam. But it needs to be remembered that here, the Islamic calendar starts where the Prophet is fleeing persecution. I think people need to understand that Islam has always not just been a religion of peace, but has been a victim of violence itself. The Prophet all his life was a victim of violence. And then obviously we know the subsequent story of the family of the household of the Prophet, how badly they were massacred and mistreated by the Muslim Arabs themselves. Yeah. So just to nail this point for your listeners, is that Prophet Muhammad early days was persecuted, and he endured those hardships with a lot of forbearance and a lot of patience indeed.
I'm going to turn to this period now. It's a very important one in relation to current affairs and what's going on in war, in peace, and what happens. In Medina, as I said, there was a time of peace. The Holy Prophet preached his message freely. The community developed and excelled in many ways. But the Meccans just could not let go, could they? The jealousies kept creeping in. And I think the migration was around 622 AD, is that right? But a couple of years later, of course, the Meccans decided to attack Medina as well and finish Islam once and for all. And this is an interesting phase in relation to how the Muslims would react and what they would do. Arif, do you want to deal with this section?
Yes, I suppose this ties in with the concept of jihad as some people might perceive it today. That I'll just read what the revelation that was received at the time. This is
because up to this time, as Amjad says, the Muslims were peace-loving people who did not react, who were persecuted and everything. Absolutely. They never took up the arms.
That's right.
But this changes.
This revelation in chapter 22, Al-Hajj, verse 40, I'll just read the translation. It states that permission to fight is given to those against whom war is made, because they have been wronged, and Allah indeed has power to help them. So although they did not want to fight, this is a commandment of Allah in stating that in a defensive war where you are attacked, where you are wronged, you are allowed and permitted to fight. Now, of course, up till now, they did everything possible to avoid fighting, to avoid retaliating. But because the Meccans were so insistent on destroying Islam, and when I say destroying, killing every single Muslim, of course, they really had no choice. They had left Mecca to Medina. They wanted to live there peacefully, but the Meccans were regrouping and they wanted to come there and they wanted to actually kill everybody. So in this situation, and following this revelation, they were given this dispensation, you can say, to defend themselves against the attackers and against the oppressors.
So here, Amjad, we have a well-formed army of around 1,000 Meccans marching on to the poor farming Muslims of Medina. Very few of them were, through the sort of art of warfare and as proper soldiers. 313 of them. The odds was stacked against them. But tell us what happened, and obviously we are here as Muslims to tell that story.
And it just so also happened to be in the middle of Ramadan. Muslims were also fasting.
They were fasting as well.
Yes, in the middle of Ramadan. And the numbers actually have been verified and by various other commentators as well. There were 313 against, some say 3,000, some say 2,005. But the opponents were definitely in their thousands. They had mounted cavalry. They were well armed and battle hardened, and they gathered the tribes of various tribes, not just the Meccan tribes, but the surrounding areas as well, are gathered to once and for all to finish the Muslims. And of course, the Prophet was there himself, but the main flanks of the Muslim army were led by Ali and Hamza, the Prophet of uncle, and the battle ensued at the place of Badr. It's kind of a midway between Mecca and Medina, I take it. And yes, it was a pitched battle, and obviously, as was the tradition, the two armies, they had called initially on their champions, and from the Muslims were represented by the Braves and also the Meccans, and I think Muslim Braves scored a major victory in their first skirmish, and then the pitched battle ensued, and Muslims were.
I mean, there are some incredible stories of bravery and courage throughout. Especially for Muslim youngsters when they reflect on this particular battle. And I think for Muslims, clearly God showed his hand as well, and the help of angels, and those brave Muslims won the day. And the Quraysh went back to Mecca, deeply upset. But they didn't stop there, did they?
They didn't. Just to mention, one of the chieftains who was the leading the whole persecution of the Muslims was called none other than Abu Jahl, and he was killed in that first battle by two youngsters. I forgot their names now, but that's become since a Muslim legend kind of thing. But you're right, of course. The Meccan pagans were further enraged, to once and for all destroy Islam, and I think within years they massed another massive army, and this time the sides met in Oud, and I think Arif can maybe...
I think, Arif, you can take
Yes,
us through, because this is an interesting battle and the lessons learned from it as well.
Yes, the Battle of Uhud had very many interesting aspects. Obviously, the Muslims had gained some strength and were fortified by the victory in the Battle of Badr. But again, about a year later, they were attacked by a bigger Meccan army, many thousands. And again, the Meccans were the Muslims were very under-resourced. But the interesting thing about this battle is that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had asked a party of them to sort of guard the rear of the battlefield. As they saw the battle developing and the Muslims becoming victorious, this party of people unfortunately didn't listen or didn't obey the Holy Prophet, and so also joined the battlefield. And amongst the Meccans, a great military leader, Khalid bin Walid, who later became a Muslim, he saw this as an opportunity to try and inflict some pain and defeat on the Muslims. So in a pincer movement, the Muslims were attacked, and it was a very dangerous time. Many Muslims were killed, and even the Holy Prophet was buried amongst a group of bodies. And at some point, people thought that even he had been killed. So this was a lesson for the Muslims, that they had to remain obedient to the Prophet if they wanted to be successful. They shouldn't be greedy. The reason why they left their positions is because they wanted to gain the booties of war. But this acted as a reminder that there could only be success if they were obedient and listened to what the Prophet said.
So clearly they went back, regrouped, and learnt their lessons and carried on trying to develop their community in Medina. But again, the Meccans wanted to attack and destroy the Muslims, and there was another battle. And I really want to move on, I suppose, to what eventually happened, and that was that Mecca was taken by the Prophet of Islam and his followers. In between, there was a period of the peace treaty of Hudaybiyah, where they tried to say, look, let's keep in our own sort of areas and not interfere with each other. But the Treaty of Hudaybiyah broke down, and eventually, Amjad, do you want to take us through the period when the Prophet of Islam marched on?
Sure, like you quite rightly said, Iqbal, in the year 628 AD, there was a treaty between the Meccans and the Medinans. It was called the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. It was basically a truce signed between the two sides, a 10-year truce. And during the truce period, the allies were free. Obviously, the tribes who were not subject to this treaty, allies of the Muslims and ally of the Meccans, were free to join either of the camp. One of the tribe called the Abu Bakr tribe, not linked with Abu Bakr Siddiq, one of the companions of the Prophet, but just another tribe. They joined, obviously, the Meccans, and the other tribes joined the Muslims. And what happened was there was a skirmish between the Abu Bakr tribe and the tribe that was allied with the Muslims. In that skirmish and kind of a mini battle, the Quraysh, the Meccan Quraysh, sided with their allies against the Muslims and their allies. So thus, inadvertently, they broke the truce, as it was. And of course, the chief of the Meccans, Abu Sufyan, sent a deputation to see the Prophet. But of course, clearly they were aiding and abetting that war and the skirmishes with the allies of the Muslims. So thus they broke the treaty, and they were not keeping to the terms of the treaty, and they're violating them at will, as it was. So obviously this could not stand. It was putting Muslims at disadvantage and their allies. Their allies were being the victims of the allies of the Meccans. And thus the Prophet in 629 AD decided to gather the Muslims and march on to Mecca. And they encamped outside the city, and the Prophet divided the army up, and they marched with the... they lit fires initially that night. I think it was again in Ramadan.
Because that's an interesting point as well, isn't it, Arif? I remember
Yes, I think about the fires, just one small, you can say, military point here, and it shows how shrewd and how guided the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, was, is that normally when a campfire is lit, there might be 30, 40 people around that campfire. but the Holy Prophet had asked his companions that each of them, wherever possible, should light a campfire. And this gave the impression to the Meccans that there was far more people than actually there was. I mean, there was a significant number, 10,000, I think is a number. But of course, that sort of intimidated them. And the good thing meant that minimized the bloodshed, that when the Prophet returned to Mecca after having been kicked out and conquered Mecca, in the sense that he returned to the place where Islam had started, there was much less bloodshed, hardly any fighting, and people were essentially forgiven. This is one of the unparalleled events in human history where mercy was shown by the Prophet, and he was able to return to Mecca.
So clearly, the Meccans came to accept the one God, and the various idols were removed from the Khana Kaaba, etc. But Islam, in a sense, was a religion for unification of whole of mankind, wasn't it, Amjad? And clearly, there's a relationship to other faiths, etc. Because when you look at, for example, the basic beliefs of Muslims, belief in the one God, all the angels, books, Day of Judgment, etc. So many things in relation to other religions as well. But tell us a little bit about the pillars of Islam, which differentiated the
well,
faith.
it's basically the creed is that there's one Lord and the Prophet Muhammad is his messenger.
Yeah.
And I think it centers, Prophet revived the old, and of course he fulfills the prophecy. And I keep going back to the Abrahamic faith, and of course not to forget that he's one of the descendants of Ishmael, and thus he fulfills the original dream of Hagar and the promise of the Lord that is given to Hagar.
So, obviously, the Holy Prophet during his life went through lots of different phases. As with all human beings, they come to their end as well. And there's lots and lots that's been written about the Holy Prophet of Islam. But the Sermon on the Mount, his last sermon on Mount, was it Arafat?
Mount Arafat.
Mount Arafat. It's a classic one. Amjad, do you want to read the first bit of it? I think it'd be good for our listeners to hear it.
Yeah, this is the last Hajj that the Prophet performed, and he gathered his companions on this mountain, and he said, "O people, listen to my words, as I may not be with you another year in this place. Be humane and just to one another. The life and property of one are sacred and inviolable to the others. Render faithfully everyone his dues, as you will appear before Lord, and he will demand an account of your actions. Treat women well, they are your helpmates, and can do nothing by themselves. You have taken them for God on trust. O people, listen to my words, and fix them in your memory. I have given you everything. I have left to you a law which you should preserve, and be firmly attached to the law, clear and positive, the Book of God and the Sunnah."
There's also a very touching point about the unity of Muslims and brotherhood, Arif, isn't there, in that
I'll
sermon?
just read two of the small paragraphs. The first one is, "O men, what I say to you, you must remember, you must hear and remember. All Muslims are as brethren to one another. All of you are equal. All men, whatever nation or tribe they may belong to, and whatever station in life they may hold, are equal." And the other small paragraph is, "Even as fingers of the two hands are equal, so are human beings equal to one another. No one has any right, any superiority to claim over another. You are as brothers."
As I said at the start of the program, it's unfortunate the attacks that we're seeing on the Holy Prophet of Islam. I'm just going to finish off with a quote from S.P. Scott, who wrote The History of the Moorish Empire, and he writes, "If the object of religion be the inculcation of morals, the diminution of evil, the promotion of human happiness, the expansion of the human intellect, if the performance of good works will avail in the great day when mankind shall be summoned to its final reckoning, it is neither irreverent nor unreasonable to admit that Muhammad was indeed an apostle of God." So with these words, I want to end this program, and I want to thank Arif and Amjad for such an interesting discussion on such an important topic as well. And I would like to ask our listeners to give us some feedback. If they use Twitter, then if they could use at VI Living History to give their feedback, any comments, whether they've enjoyed any of the programs and how we can improve them as well. So I hope you've found this program interesting. Inshallah, we're going to build on these programs in relation to Islam and the Islamic civilization. Assalamu alaikum.